Hi friends, this is Anders Ibsen from Windermere Professional Partners, managing broker of Anders Ibsen Homes. And yes, this is another video about commission lawsuits. Hopefully they'll last for some time because as of now, third quarter 2024, there seems to be a new status quo here with Washington State real estate. But what does this mean for you as a consumer? So let's have a little bit of a history lesson for how we got here. So buyers having their own real estate agents is actually a pretty new thing. Historically, home buyers in Washington State only had their own brokers since the mid-1990s. And the main way that those brokers got paid was from closing proceeds from the seller, and in particular, the seller's firm. So the seller would sign a contract with the listing broker, and then the listing broker's firm would then share commission with the buyer broker's firm in exchange for that broker bringing a buyer. And that was how things worked until fairly recently, until these commission lawsuits happened. And without diving too much into the weeds, the basis for these lawsuits was that because of this firm sharing revenue model, this had the effect of artificially inflating commissions and just not making it clear to consumers how these commission amounts got arrived at, let alone leaving any room for negotiation. So that's what's been challenged and changed. Thankfully, Washington State is a lot more enlightened. We actually got ahead of this as a real estate community years ago, and the state legislature did as well. And we'll talk about that in a moment for what that means. And effectively, what this means at the very highest level, the biggest changes that we've seen is that buyer brokers still work for you. You can still have a buyer's agent, and buyer brokers still get paid at closing. But what's primarily changed is two main things for you as a consumer. One is that if you're a home buyer, you now have to have a signed fee agreement with your agent prior to doing most real estate services, is what the term is. And a real estate service is a pretty broad category, but it can mean anything from obvious things like writing an offer on a property, showing properties, and other very direct activities, but also more subtle gray area type activities too, like referring a lender to you, referring a contractor, doing an analysis of the market in a certain neighborhood. These are all real estate activities that now require you to sign a fee agreement with your buyer broker that basically stipulates how they will get paid and how much they'll get paid. And we'll talk about that later in the video. The second major change is how we legally consider buyer broker compensation. Because instead of buyer broker compensation being a dollar amount that is shared between a listing broker firm and a buyer broker firm, think of buyer broker commission as a closing cost owed by the buyer that is negotiable with the other side and with the broker. So those are very subtle but big changes, and fundamentally they're a good thing. It's a good thing to introduce more transparency, more ability for negotiation among consumers. But all this being said, these are all abstractions. What does this really mean for you as a consumer now that we're in this new normal in Washington State? So fundamentally, if you're going to buy or sell real estate anytime soon in Washington, you're going to notice three main changes, and they're all going to be reflected in new contract forms. So the first thing is, if you're a home buyer, you are now legally required as of January 2024 to sign what's called a buyer's agency agreement with your broker if you want to be represented by a broker prior to doing any kind of major real estate service like offering on a house, touring houses, or other services supported by your broker. What this means is you have to sign an agreement that transparently discloses how much your broker works for, and also giving the ability to negotiate with the seller for paying some or all of that amount. And we'll get into in a moment what that means for a purchase situation. But there are other details too. What a buyer's agency agreement also provides is allowing for clarification as to, do you exclusively have a business relationship with this broker? Are you working with multiple buyer's agents, for example? Are you okay with your broker also representing the seller, which is a situation called limited dual agency, and other important factors that are now out in the open. So that's the first change you'll notice, and that's been the law for some time. The second thing you'll notice is if you're a home seller, the listing agreement looks very different. So prior to very recently, the standard form you would sign if you're a home seller and you're listing your home through a real estate agent is the section where buyer broker compensation is mentioned. Because even after Washington State pivoted and made it very clear that offers of compensation to buyer's agents are not something shared between firms, but it's a seller cost and a buyer closing cost, so effectively a seller credit to cover a buyer closing cost. Even with that change, the section that talks about that still treated buyer broker compensation like it was a given. How much are you going to offer to pay the buyer broker? And now what you're going to see with the new forms is significantly more options and more clarity for home sellers. So if you're a home seller, that section where it talks about buyer broker compensation has three main options. The first option is you still have the right to offer compensation to a buyer broker if you choose. And as a sidebar, this is actually a very big difference between Washington State and many of the other states that were affected by the settlement in the commission lawsuits, because our multiple listing service is independently owned. It's not owned by the National Association of Realtors. So you still have the ability, if you so choose, to offer compensation to buyer brokers. And we'll get into why that is a strategic factor for you. The second option that you have as a home seller, instead of outright advertising a compensation amount to home buyers for their agents, is simply inviting buyers to ask for the amount they want and then negotiating it. If you choose this option, what buyers are going to see when they look at your listing in the multiple listing service is simply three words: request in offer. And then all that means is the buyer is going to write in the purchase agreement how much they want you as a home seller to pay them to compensate their buyer broker, and then you can either accept their amount or negotiate it. That's the second option. The third option is you can simply make no offer whatsoever and just say zero. And that's something you've always been able to do anyway. There's no requirement that sellers compensate buyer brokers, but as this is a revision that's based in expanding transparency for consumers, it's more clear that this is an option that sellers have. So you have these three options, and they all have very strategic components, mostly because since it's clear that buyer broker compensation is effectively a buyer closing cost, offers of compensation to the buyer broker basically have affordability implications, meaning that if a buyer might be at the margins of their ability to pay for something, then how much a buyer owes their broker may be a deciding factor as to whether they can afford your house, which means that may impact the buyer pool on your house potentially. So that is a factor to consider. Finally, something that you'll see if you're either a home buyer or a home seller is baked into the very purchase and sale agreement itself. Very plainly, very clearly, on page 1 of the purchase and sale agreement, there will be a line where if the seller is offering compensation to the buyer broker, both parties are going to acknowledge that. And whatever the buyer wants to do, because remember, this is a choice between buyers and sellers, it's not between real estate agents anymore. Buyer broker compensation is something that buyers and sellers now directly negotiate in the purchase agreement. There will be a section right next to that line where buyer and seller agree on what, if anything, the buyer broker is going to work for. And that's where the negotiation happens. So the seller may advertise a certain compensation. It could be a percentage, it could be a flat fee, it could be some other kind of incentive, or they could offer nothing at all. And the buyer, if they are represented by an agent and they want to ask you as a seller to pay for some or all of their buyer broker's fee, that amount is going to be in a specific, easy to find place at the bottom of the first page of the purchase and sale agreement. So this is fundamentally a good thing because questions of how agents are paid, let alone how consumers are able to negotiate for these things, is now going to be even clearer and just clear as day on the first page of the purchase and sale agreement when you buy a home or when you sell a home. So those are the three major changes you're going to see. And it's unclear how this really is going to affect the market or affect the cost of these services. Different people have different business models. But one thing I am pretty clear about is that transparency is just a good thing. So having more informed home buyers and home sellers who have a clearer idea of how much these services cost and how to negotiate with each other over how much they cost, it's fundamentally a good thing, and I think we will see more negotiation, certainly, as a result of this. So if you ever have questions about how broker compensation works, or just general market questions, or what this means for your house or your purchase situation, you're always welcome to reach out to me. I'd love to hear from you, and I really appreciate you watching this video. Have a great day, and thanks for watching.